Lance Mortlock. You are a strategic planner with Ernst and Young right here in Canada, and you have provided management consulting services for over 20 years. Wow, you have been at this a long time, to more than 60 organizations in 11 countries, overseeing hundreds of projects. And also, you are a visiting professor at the University of Calgary. And today, we will be speaking about your debut book, Disaster Proof Scenario Planning for a Post Pandemic Future. Lance, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You make me
So,
sound old when you describe my background. I'm old, but not that old.
well, I mean, maybe not on, all in age, but let's say all in experience. I mean, I see all the countries where you have been, all the corporations that you have worked for. So it's a uh, you have you have a lot of knowledge on the your experience, Bill. Let me ask you. So you were born in England. How is it you were always interested in business, or tell us about what were you thinking when you were 17 years old?
Oh, okay. When I was 17 years old,
You were trying to decide what to do
so
with your life
I was probably
professionally.
thinking about where the next beer was going to come from, or you know, what I was going to do on Saturday night. But in seriousness, um, how did I get involved in business? I really kind of fell into it. So I did a science undergrad degree originally, which was fun. It was interesting, and I'm a naturally curious kind of guy. And I remember talking to a long time mentor of mine, and he said, what are you going to do with your life? Where are you going to take it? And I kind of looked at that and kind of had that discussion with him. And I said, well, I'm not sure. And he said, well, have you thought about doing an MBA? And I said, well, no, not really. And so I began to investigate, what it would be like to do my master's in business, and ended up doing my MBA. And then at the end of that sort of year and a half long, very intensive program, um, there was a career fair, and the career fair, I was a consulting company, Anderson Consulting, at the career fair. So I got talking to them about Anderson Consulting, big global consulting firm, with operations in 150 countries. And they said, yeah, you should think about consulting because you get the opportunity to advise and work with different organizations. And so I kind of fell into it, and ended up being part of a consulting organization that took me all over the world, advising organizations on all kinds of things. So that's kind of how it started. I like
Right.
to think it was sort of something that was purposefully thought out, but it really didn't happen that way.
Life is sometimes an accident. But let me ask you, oh, you have been over so many countries, and why Canada? I'm sure it's not because of the weather. So how come you ended, and you come from England, by the way, in case I didn't mention that for the listeners.
Well, I would say in Calgary, it's yet another sunny day. So it might be cold this side of the country, but the sun always shines. Like how I got to Canada was an interesting one. So I ended up in sort of the first 10 years of my consulting career doing a lot of work with energy companies, particularly oil and gas, power and utility companies all over the world. And an opportunity came up to help open and develop an office for Accenture here in Calgary. And I love the mountains. I love to ski, and so does my wife. She speaks French. She's originally from France. And so living in Canada was kind of like this match made in heaven, where, it's a dual language, great place to raise a family, a lot of interesting stuff going on from a business perspective, and we could ski at the weekends. So we came here originally on an expat deal for a couple of years, and we just fell in love with the country, and 12 years later, we're still here, and we've become, dual citizens. So we're both Canadian citizens as well now. And like the rest is history. I don't look back. I enjoy working and living in this beautiful country.
Wow. Okay. You have been working for the oil or consulting with the oil and gas industry. And when we look at the global sphere, we think of Canada as a big gas station for the world. But less lately, I mean, people are turning to other source of energy, and oil and gas is beginning to get a bad rap. Where do you fit in there in that new scenario?
Yeah, and it's a great question, Alan. I think the oil and gas industry is in a period of massive change and transition. I think people are naturally and rightly so very, very concerned about the climate, about global warming and what it means, ESG, and those kinds of things. And so, as consumers continue to sort of switch their habits in terms of how they consume, the types of cars that they drive, like EVs, that creates a huge amount of pressure on oil and gas companies to kind of reinvent themselves, to clean up how they produce oil and gas, but also to think about their portfolio, the types of businesses and assets that they invest in the future. So I think the next 30 years is going to be a massive period of transition and change and disruption. So it's a great time to, do what I do, which is advise leadership teams, not only in oil and gas, but I also work in, other sectors as well. There's going to be a lot of change coming up here.
Wow, okay, amazing. Okay, so then you have your busy life as a consultant, and then you decide to write a book, Disaster Proof. What inspired you to write this book? Was it the COVID-19 pandemic and see how unprepared we were, or is this something that you had in the works already before the pandemic?
Yeah, there's a few things that spurred me to do it. So one was I prior to writing the book, I'd actually spent the best part of a decade writing a lot of blogs, points of view on all kinds of business topics. And I just suddenly said to myself, about 2 years ago, you know what, I need to, at this point in my career, write a book. And what fascinates me about the type of work that I do in the strategic space is thinking about the future. And it was only really during the pandemic that the book started to take shape from a scenario and a post-pandemic future perspective. And I think we live in this period right now of a huge amount of what I call VUCA. So that's, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. There's a huge amount of VUCA going on in the world. And I kind of looked at that as I was stuck in my office here for months and months on end, thinking, well, how can companies and organizations, both private and in the public sector, deal with VUCA in better ways? And we've got great tools, they're just not used. And so that's how the book started to evolve. And I've been doing scenario planning as a consultant for 20 years. I mean, it started very early on in my career with Shell in Europe. And so I began to sort of explore that concept and really develop, the key aspects of the book.
Okay, so can you start now that we speak about the book? What exactly is scenario planning?
Yeah, I mean, it really is about thinking about the future and thinking about the future in terms of multiple scenarios that could play out. It's about thinking about scenarios that are plausible or possible. It's about thinking about the good and the bad and something in between. So it's a way of stretching your thinking, because I find that naturally as human beings, we tend to gravitate to what I call the center, which is what's comfortable, what's normal, what's expected. And what I'm saying is we were completely caught off guard, as it relates to the pandemic. And it'll happen again. It might not be a pandemic the next time, but it'll be something else. So how do we as leaders of organizations, both in the public and the private sector, figure out ways to be better prepared for an uncertain future? And that really is the premise of the book.
Right. Okay. In the case of the pandemic, but any previous crisis that we have before, let's say the financial crisis of 2008, the thing that makes them crisis is that they are things that no one could imagine that would happen, or maybe yes, a quite few. Like let's say Bill Gates did a speech on on how COVID could arrive at any moment, and even in the United States, they had a playbook on how to deal with a possible pandemic, which leadership decided to put aside and take the action of denying or hiding. So yeah, I mean, you know, these crises are crises because we have a hard time predicting them. So that makes, I guess, your job essential, but at the same time, difficult. And if nothing goes wrong, then your job is almost redundant. Oh, nothing is happening. We don't need lands because nothing has happened for the past 20 years.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, there's a few things that you said there, so let me unpack that a little bit.
Yes, I'm sorry, I gave you so many.
You gave me a lot there. So a couple of things. Scenario planning is not about predicting the future. That's forecasting.
Right.
Right. So prediction through forecasting is saying there's one possible future, and we're going to forecast what that future looks like. Scenario planning is saying, what are the multiple possible futures that could play out? So that's the first thing. The second thing that you said that is really interesting is the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation, and the Johns Hopkins University. They ran an event, as I was researching for the book, called Event 201 back in 2018. And what Event 201 looked at was a possible pandemic, a COVID type pandemic. What would it do? What would it result in? And what recommendations using scenario planning would this very powerful group have? And honestly, Alan, they predicted it to a T what would happen. And the unfortunate thing is everybody ignored them. And in fact, CSIS, the Center for Strategies and International Studies in the US, did a very similar exercise and went through that exercise and figured out, okay, if a COVID pandemic happened, here's how that would play out. And again, it was ignored. So what my big thing is as an advisor is, and why I wrote the book is, we've got to take some of these tools, particularly scenario planning, more seriously, because it's very, very powerful. And it was proven by, the exercise Event 201 by with the World Economic Forum and others, and by CSIS. And that's sort of the mental hurdle I think we have to overcome, that how do we leverage these powerful tools and take them more seriously? And I think in the next few years, we're going to see a surge in all kinds of organizations using this type of tool to make sense of the environment, the complex world we live in.
Okay, so I see with your book, you try to raise the importance of scenario planning, but at the same time, as a consultant, I'm sure you have presented different leaders with these are the possible scenarios, these are the things that could happen, and we could prevent them or be prepared for them if we do X, Y, and Z. And I'm sure even though you have been paid handsomely, you have been completely ignored. So how do you deal with that? And how can governments and corporations deal with, I don't know, leadership that refuse to play out the different scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more frustrating as a consultant, as a strategic advisor, that you give advice and then you're ignored. That's not the most pleasant part of, what I do for a living. But I think you do your best,
Right.
and you hope that leaders will at least take something of what you share with them seriously. And you know, the other aspect of your question, I think, is a challenge for leaders in any kind of organization is, um, you know, how much money and how much resource can I spend on being prepared? There's kind of a realism check to say, yes, if I'm in an airline, you know, I'll tell you an interesting story. I was working with an airport here in Canada. I won't say which one, and I was chatting and having a dialogue with the CEO and the management team. And we were saying, you know, how bad could things be? And this was a few years ago. You know, what's the worst case situation for this organization? And the CEO looked at me and he said, you know, during 9/11, airline traffic in North America dropped by 5%. I said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, so what do you think the worst case situation would be in the future? He said, well, let's just add 1%. We'll call it 6%. You fast forward to April, May in 2020, during the height of the COVID pandemic, airline travel across the globe dropped 95%. And so we were so wrong. And I like to think, you know, I'm reasonably smart. That CEO is a lot smarter than I am. And, you know, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. You know, we get into this comfort zone, this middle zone of what seems reasonable. Well, it can't be worse than 6%. But even if we thought about 95%, do we have the money and the resources to spend preparing for that? Would shareholders accept that? Probably not.
No.
But at least we stretch the thinking beyond that norm
Right.
to what I call the riverbanks a bit further out. Do you know what I mean, Alan?
I know what you mean. I mean, we have right now the Suez Canal is being blocked by one ship. This one ship is blocking the supply chains of so many corporations right now. And I'm sure, you know, they are freaking out. But in the other, on the other hand, is they have this scenario planning and keep extra inventory, then they will have competitive prices compared to their competitors, and maybe they will be, I don't know, not having as many rosy financial reports. So it's just very difficult to strategize all this. Even if you prepare for the worst case scenario, then that could put you in a position that you are less competitive than your than your competition. So yeah, it's tough, and I guess that's why you still have a job to,
Yeah.
to
I was,
try
yeah, I
to.
was just thinking, do you want a job? Because that sounded pretty good.
Let me ask you, what are some levels, you chapter 4, levels of application? How can we apply scenario planning? And in particularly, so you go through different levels, but if you could focus in regular individual day-to-day life, how can they apply scenario planning in their day-to-day life?
In business, you mean,
Right,
or?
right.
Yeah, I mean, so I talk about, there's a whole chapter on levels. And so at a high level, the 4 levels are, you can do it at a macro level, like Event 201, where we were looking a couple of years ago about the possibility of a COVID pandemic, the climate crisis. You can do that with big macro stuff, emergencies, hurricanes, those kind of things. Then you get down to the next level, which is what I call the industry level. And so that might be, you say, well, to your question, Alan, earlier, like what about oil and gas in Canada and the future of oil and gas? You know, it's a very tenuous time for the industry. Can we work on scenarios for the industry, a specific industry? So that's the next level that I talk about in the book. And then you get to the organizational level. So this is where it starts to get very specific to the organization. And so an organization would say, you know, let's take a utility company. One of the very exciting things in the utility space right now is the future of the prosumer. You know, people putting solar panels on their roof, generating electricity that they consume in their house, and then they sell back to the grid, fundamentally changing how utilities work all across the world. And then you take EVs, and so suddenly we've got these EV charging ports in various garages across Canadian households. Let's think about that. How fast will EV adoption be? In fact, I wrote a Canadian paper on EV adoption, and we created a high adoption scenario, a medium, and a low adoption. And then we evaluated what would be the impact on the utility companies based on high, medium, and low. And so that's a very real way of using scenarios at an enterprise level. And then you get down to sort of the business unit, the function, or the project. And a classic example is, you know, you're an organization trying to make a multi-million or a multi-billion-dollar investment, and you might use scenarios to say, under different situations from an environmental perspective, what would we do with this project and how would we execute this capital project? That's one example. But then I bring it down to your question around the individual. And I think you can use scenarios in all aspects of your life, your personal life. I think about, you know, I used to do quite a lot of mountaineering, and, you know, I recall I was on a big expedition in Alaska climbing Mount McKinley, and we use scenarios to kind of prepare for various possible eventualities that could happen on the mountain. So it's a tool so powerful that it works at different levels. It can work in your professional life, but also your personal life as well.
Wow. Okay. The last chapter is scenario planning in new frontiers, and you talk about artificial intelligence. So, what's the role of artificial intelligence in scenario planning?
Yeah, so this is probably one of my favorite parts of the book because it's funny. I've been reading in the last couple of years a lot about AI, artificial intelligence, and I think, Alan, the more that I read, the scarier it becomes in terms of the future of AI. I think a lot in the last decade, AI has sort of been this tool that helps with a lot of operational type decisions, you know, whether you are going to be proposed through Netflix or Amazon a particular book or a particular movie based on an algorithm. AI works very, very well for those kinds of those day-to-day decisions. The new frontier, which I talk about in the book, is AI emerging in much more strategic type decisions. You know, they're using AI right now around hurricane prediction. They're using AI in banking systems to make predictions around stock trading. So it's becoming much more strategic in its utility. So it is, and really, what I explore in the book is if you take different steps in the scenario development process, there's particular steps that lend themselves to AI support. And those steps are data-heavy steps, steps that have kind of a logical algorithm. And in fact, in some organizations, there's an organization here in Canada that in the government that uses natural language processing, which really is just a way of looking at social media and other language on the web and drawing out risks and threats from that. And so you think about COVID, and there are tools that exist today where we can leverage AI to actually look for virus chatter on the World Wide Web and draw out that actually, okay, now we're starting to have a problem because, you know, various news agencies or Twitter or Facebook or other social media is starting to demonstrate this is becoming a big issue, and we can react and make strategic decisions around that. I really think, Alan, that the future of strategic processes like scenario planning will be what I call collective intelligence, where you bring machines and AI and humans to work together to extend the value of and the power of how we make decisions, and we use data to make those decisions. So it's a scary area, but it's also a very powerful area, and it's going to allow us in the future to do a lot more with these types of processes.
Right. Okay. Scenario planning, as presented in your book, is, to me, it seemed like something new. I have never read a book on scenario planning ever before, but isn't this something that business have been doing for all the time? Maybe not eh, in a well organized format as your book, but I mean, this is what people do. They have to weigh the different possibilities, and then try to figure out which scenario fits them better for making better business projections or planning or whatever. So is this a new field, or is this something that it's always been but you're bringing it to light?
Yeah, no, it's not something new. What I'm trying to do is, I think a lot of leaders are overwhelmed in a world where there are so many different management tools that exist. And what I'm trying to do is sort of resurface this to say, you know, we live in this period of VUCA, right?
Okay.
And now is a good time to sort of re-look at this if you've forgotten about it and take it more seriously. Having said that, I think that there are some aspects of the book that are particularly new. You talked about levels. That's particularly new in terms of thinking about scenario planning in this sort of purposeful way. Are we working at the macro, the industry, the enterprise, or, you know, maybe the individual level? And then I think this aspect of the next frontier and the use of AI and natural language processing really propels this type of tool to totally new areas that haven't been explored before. And that's been something that, you know, is new and hasn't been written about in the way that I address it in the book. So very exciting, and a new area that I think many are going to be exploring in the future.
Right. And when we look at different scenarios, I guess we should also rank them with different levels of probability. For example, scenario A, there's I don't know, 50% of probability of this scenario happening, or and then scenario B, 25%, and so on and so forth. And in the case of COVID, we could say that the probability of that was quite low, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think probability ranking is certainly an area that you can explore. And I think when you go through a process like scenario planning, you have to say, okay, of all those scenarios, which one do we think is going to play out?
Right.
I remember, as part of my research for the book, looking at the Port of Vancouver here in Canada, and they were using scenarios to look at what they called Port 2050. What would the Port of Vancouver, which is a very important port for our country, look like in 30 years' time? And the scenario that they rallied around was one around energy transition and the importance of climate and sustainability. And so through the scenario planning process, they ended up forming a partnership with BC Hydro around energy. So it was an example in my mind of using scenarios to think about different futures, rallying around a future that you think is going to be important, and then importantly, Alan, taking action to prepare for that future. And that's exactly what the Port of Vancouver did, which I think is a really neat example.
Right. Just out of curiosity, in regards to the Port of Vancouver, was the probability of the shipping through Alaska now with the ice melting, was that considered as a probability, and what to do if that happened?
It's a good question. I have no idea. But I think it goes back to, you know, you think about what's going on in the Suez Canal with the tanker that's stuck there, the transport tanker. Like, could they have envisaged something like that blocking such an important shipping route? Like, I don't know. I haven't talked to them, but
Well, I mean,
had they thought about it, would they have made different kind of investment decisions around maybe a special dredging ship that's on standby should something like that happen? You know, but a special dredging ship maybe costs lots of money, and the probability that it happens is very small. So you know what? Let's just assume it won't happen and not make that investment decision. These are the kinds of dynamics that leadership teams are trying to figure out all the time, right?
well, in the case of the Suez Canal, I could assume they saw a possible scenario of being disrupted by political reasons, you know, like a blockage of one country versus the other one, let's say Israel, but not the wind, because that's what created the blockage was the wind blowing and shifted the ship in a particular way that it just got stuck. So amazing stuff. Okay, well, this highlight the importance of your book. I wonder if you could just give us the title one more time of the book, and also where can people follow you?
Yeah, so disaster-proof scenario planning for a post-pandemic future, and people can follow me on LinkedIn and visit my website www.lancemortlock.com.
Thank you so much, Lance.
Thank you for having me, Alan.